Okay, presumably we've started. So welcome to this session on mission-oriented innovation, addressing societal challenges, with myself, Rick Delbridge, and Dylan Henderson from Cardiff University, and Kelly Byrne from the Cardiff Capital Region. We're hoping to be joined by our colleague Kevin Morgan, but he's not with us just yet, so hopefully he'll make it before he's due to speak. Dylan, you've got the slides. Are you ready to share those and we'll make a start?
Yep.
Smashing. So, as I say, welcome to the session. Kelly is the director of the Cardiff Capital Region, and she'll be talking in broader terms about the mission approach that the region is undertaking. And Dylan, myself and Kevin are all members of the Centre for Innovation Policy Research. We've been working with Kelly and her team in particular to develop a challenge fund, which we'll go into in a little bit more detail later on. First off, though, Dylan will kind of set the scene for us in terms of the literature and the underpinning theory that's informing the approach that we've been taking. Then Kelly will talk in more detail about the Capital Region's approach itself, and then either Kevin or I will talk a little bit about how we're partnering with the CCR to deliver on this agenda. Over to you, Dylan.
Okay, so hello everyone. As Rick said, I'm Dylan Henderson, and I'm going to be talking about the literature and policy practice around new models of innovation. And I guess I'll begin with mission-oriented innovation policy, because that's really what we're looking at here. This is a key development within the innovation policy sphere, associated with people like Mazzucato, but not exclusively. And this is a concept which draws attention to the directionality of innovation policy, essentially looking towards the future and looking at how we might be able to develop approaches towards innovation that might aid the future. Traditionally, it's been thought of in terms of technological innovation, so the idea of the Apollo mission, for example. But in recent years, it's become much broadened out significantly with respect to looking at directionality in terms of climate change, environmental quality, aging society, and so on. It's also, I guess, this approach is also associated with new approaches for government, and Mazzucato, as you can see here, is talking about the government role in terms of making strategic investments to aid those missions, etc. But as we'll talk about later, that can potentially be a much broader role as well. So moving on then, in terms of these new models of innovation, they're being framed, as I've already spoken about, in terms of the mission economy, but an emerging sort of area which particularly focuses around social innovation is this emerging concept of the foundational economy. And that refers to the so-called everyday or mundane, although I don't like that framing necessarily, the everyday sectors of the economy, which could be things like health, social care, food, water, housing, broadband infrastructure, and so on. These are things that are said to constitute the everyday, the civilized nature of the economy, the infrastructure of everyday life. And this is providing a framing, this concept of foundation economy, providing a framing for innovation policy as well. But as I said, social innovation. So how can social innovation be brought to bear on the challenges that these sectors face and the opportunities for them to, for example, aid public service delivery? So is this bringing the state back into these innovation models in a different way? Well, yes and no. Yes, we are seeing in these innovation models the role for the state to take very different roles beyond funding. So the state as co-creator, market maker, etc. This enabling role, which is far from different to the idea of a hierarchical state commanding and controlling private sector and public sector to act. But this is a role for the state as well to act alongside other actors And this is where this sort of takes us towards the concept of the innovation ecosystem and the state and other public sector actors having a role in enabling and supporting innovation. We can also see that these concepts are about much more capacious understanding of innovation, this idea that it's not just about high tech, it's about socio-ecological forms of innovation as well. And also this idea of the innovation commons, so the skills, the assets, the information that is provided on a common basis, a common pool of these things enables all actors to innovate. So finally, for me, we can see that these new innovation models as well are also adding to the complexity potentially of or being introduced in a context which is becoming much more complex, much more polycentric. So multiple sources of policy, for example, might be engaged in the innovation space. We can see that in terms of that context is partly about policy, the policy environment, the political environment is becoming more complex. If we think in terms of the UK and our own region, we have national UK government, we have Welsh government, the devolved administration, and then we have municipalities and we have other framings as well, city deals, which we'll be talking about. We also have, I guess, as I've described earlier, this idea that innovation itself, innovation policy is becoming more diverse. So this idea of socio-ecological innovation alongside science and technology-based innovations. We would argue the two are complementary in many respects and need to be seen alongside each other. And then finally, we have, when we start talking about things like missions and grand challenges, we automatically bring in a much broader range, a much more heterodox group of agents into the innovation space. And municipalities are part and parcel of that. And municipalities not necessarily thought traditionally as being key innovation actors, but we will be talking about the Cardiff Capital Region Challenge Fund as an example of that. So I'll pass over to you, Kelly.
Very much, Dylan, and really glad to be here this afternoon. So I'm going to tell you a little bit about the Cardiff Capital Region, my region, and how it fits really into the picture that Dylan has just described, and how we're using our convening power, if you like, as an interventionist city region to help frame, share and solve societal problems that have a good role in terms of economic and societal impact. Okay. So the first thing I wanted to talk about really was, the importance of having a strong sense of purpose, because I think it's this duality of sort of economic impact and societal gains that really defines the Cardiff Capital Region, which is a tripartite partnership. It works across 10 local authorities in South East Wales with both Wales Government and UK Government. One of the things that we do is to oversee a £1.3 billion city deal, which is a growth or a devolution deal with UK Government and Welsh Government. We're in the process, though, of also establishing as a separate legal entity, a corporate entity in our own right. And as well as delivering funding programmes, we'll soon have sweeping powers in relation to regional transport, land use planning and economic well-being. But I think, that the key point for us, and I know if my political leaders were here, they'd be emphasising this, we're not here to hit targets that miss the point. Yes, we're here to deliver a government devolution programme, but I think the point about setting up as our own regional entity is really about bringing our own personality and value set to what we're trying to do in the region, which is really important when you consider in the Cardiff Capital Region, it's quite a small space, population of just over 1.5 million, only probably 60 miles in length, 130 in width. But in that space, you've got some of the most prosperous communities, cheek by jowl, with some of the least prosperous communities in the whole of the UK. And I think, that concept of inclusive growth and how do we really do it? How do we get under the skin of it is really, really important to us. And the pandemic, I think, has reminded us that research and innovation isn't therefore just about, economic benefit. as the end. You know, the end has to be something else. It has to be something more than that. We're here really just to think about how we facilitate economic gain, sure, but also to anticipate and respond to social problems. So as Dylan was saying, it's really important that we define innovation in the richest possible sense, in public services, in civic society, and in both the tradable and foundational economies. So the next thing that I suppose I wanted to say on that theme and on that topic, if I can have the next slide, please, is just to really talk about, you know, for it's not enough just to do well. You know, the region needs to be doing good as well. And as Mariana Mazzucato always says, you know, it's a myth that only businesses create value and public services are here just to sort of passively de-risk and troubleshoot and to solve problems and to meekly enable. I think our mantra is very much one of developing the ability of the public sector to create, shape markets, to be a co-investor, to take risk for reward, and the big responsibility that comes with that as well. And to really think at a very granular level about some of the problems that we're trying to solve. That involves a different type and scale of interaction between all the different sectors and partners that I've been talking about. But I think as well, it's about some of the cultural issues. If we're going to drive innovation in systemic terms, there's going to be constant disequilibria. You know, nothing's going to be certain. We've got to experiment more and explore. And there's going to be a lot of trying new things, and failure is inherent in that. And I don't mean in a reckless way. You know, it's got to be something we think about very, very carefully. But I think, you know, we have to think about how we go beyond just transactional stuff, and how we work with the businesses and the other sectors and the other contributors who want to be part of finding solutions, not just creating problems. Okay, the next one then, please. So, you know, I call us interventionist, and you know, maybe that's a good way of describing it. But I suppose there's just a certain wariness over big ideas and jump into obvious solutions. You know, I'm sure we've all seen an array of sort of, you know, technical solutions looking for problems. So being really clear about what it is we're here to do and some of the big challenges we face. So sure, you know, some of that does involve things like the world's first compound semiconductor cluster, not because I say, but independently we've had that verified. Some work we're doing around insurtech, medical diagnostics and devices, the media and creative industries. We have some of those USPs, which are traditionally in some of those tech sectors I've just spoken about. But what we're trying to do is to build the ecosystems around that, to make sure that, yes, we have a focus on high value added industrial sectors, but these things are innovation rich too. We're bringing through the skills and talent pipeline. We're thinking about the needs of clusters in a different way, the role of the public sector in terms of underwriting some of the risk, thinking about patient continuity finance, how we make sure benefits spread across supply chains and we get those supplier effects into some of those areas of the region that may not normally be part of this, how we take those opportunities for local wealth building and really build upon them. And clearly things like the Strength in Places programme, which Research England runs with Innovate UK, and we've got two very successful programmes operating under that, I think give us the opportunity to explore, to be bold, and to try out these new things. So the challenges for us are not predicated on a few big macro variables, the big ideas, the winners. And it's no longer just about supply side policies, but understanding, I think, in a closer and more thoughtful way, the dynamics of demand-led innovation. So why mission-led innovation? And I think, you know, it comes back to some of the points that Dylan was making about the importance of social science here, especially in terms of understanding some of those key economic, social and political interactions. We need economic benefits to work with progressive social policies. These two things have to go together. And I think that we favour mission-driven innovation because it really allows us to have a more targeted approach. If we say we're going to take X problem and solve it, that means we can think about, you know, how we influence the rate, distribution, and the direction of innovation. How can we make it sort of generalized? How can we share it? How can we make it sustainable? How can we make it equitable? How can we target perhaps some of the areas that haven't been part of these conversations to date. And I think that it really appeals to us because direct admissions have a very clear purpose on day one. It's about much more than just the traditional checkbox of corporate social responsibility indicators or, blanket ESG policies. We are coming together to do something different. We're going on a journey together. So sometimes it can be risky because we don't know the answers. There's a lot of uncertainty. But I think we have to ask ourselves the question, if we're going to be genuinely interventionist and convene the different actors together, are we going to have a go? Are we going to try and do things differently? Or are we going to fail by omission, by not trying and not taking those risks at all? So if I can have the next slide, please. And in the Cardiff Capital Region, I suppose our clear mantra is we're choosing to have a go. And I think what I'm talking about is much more of a mindset, really. It's a culture that is evident perhaps in lots of areas of our work, but no more so in the Local Wealth Building Challenge Fund and our programme called Infuse, Innovative Future Services, which seeks to build the capacity and capability in public services to convene around some of those big challenges and to shape and influence how we work with other sectors to build the solutions that we all need to see. So it's one framework. It's a £16 million seed fund. And what we're trying to do that is gather the public bodies that are grappling with some really big problems around the future of high streets, food security, public transport, what we do about decarbonisation from a public point of view. So lots of different things in there. And I think it's about this, as I've said on the slide, this new form of collective action between public, private, colleagues in universities to see how we can integrate social challenges into research and innovation frameworks. So it's this concept, I think, of civic regard in innovation, civic regard in entrepreneurship, that we really need to solve problems because we need that ingenuity and we need to think about different ways that we can unlock that. So I suppose what we're trying to do is to convene around the big challenges, put them out there and build the capacity of people, organisation, institutions, the private sector to work with us to solve some of those big problems through a process of research and development, which is, it can be quite new and different, especially from a public sector procurement point of view. So yeah, economic outcomes, because we're trying to procure innovation, but social value, because we're trying to do it through innovative procurement at the same time. So clearly the role of science and technology is still critical. Of course, the knowledge economy will play a massive role in this, but it's some of the softer stuff as well, the different collaborations, disciplines coming together on the innovation scene to really change that capability for innovation from the bottom up. So if I can have the last one, please. Okay, so a little bit more detail then on the Challenge Fund programme. I've already explained the different funding components. So we are trying to build on the SBRI approach, so the Small Business Research Initiative, which Innovate UK have rolled out really successfully, but also trying to think about other approaches to challenge-driven innovation and a focus, hopefully, in the future on big missions. So role for the public sector, which is quite different to the traditional way of working, but really thinking about collaboration, creation, stimulation of new markets, how products, services, new functions can perhaps be commercialized and scaled so that we're nurturing that concept of return on investment so we can recycle funds, so we're building resilience for the future. So the next one, please. So yeah, Cardiff Capital Region, a public services innovation testbed. I certainly think that's something that we're trying to work towards and seeing a lot of our work programmes really through the lens of challenge-driven innovation, trying to resist that urge that we sometimes have to jump to immediate and obvious solutions and really take ourselves through the discipline of the challenge process, which, as I say, raises lots of important questions for us to think about. Important because I think the characteristics of public investment and involvement are changing today. I think with the wellbeing of future generations in Wales, which makes it a statutory requirement to look ahead, we're leaning towards a much more long-term, participative, foresight-focused and experimental culture. And I think as well, from the Cardiff Capital Region's perspective, this shared view really that competitiveness, especially in an economic sense, has to mean so much more than just unit wage costs over prices if we're going to move increasingly towards the well-being economy. So I've mentioned risk and failure. I think it requires a really sophisticated understanding. I think we talk about failure far too easily, and I think recent examples have shown risk taking, especially from a public sector point of view, has to come with a huge dose of responsibility, and we've got to create those risk-wise cultures. I think there's a huge role for social science here alongside traditional science. In fact, I think sometimes traditional science has crowded out the social sciences in innovation because we need different kinds of policy support, different approaches, different collaborations. And I think sometimes the typical investment rate of return model is too traditional for what we're trying to do. So making the link across businesses and societal challenges, crowding in the private spend on R&D to complement public spend on research and development is definitely the way to go. I think lots of lessons learned for me, and I know Rick is going to touch upon those now, because I'm naturally impatient, and I think it does take time to legitimize mission-led or challenge-driven innovation, especially if it is to become a competitive asset in itself, which is certainly our hope for the Cardiff Capital Region. So Rick, I think you're going to expand upon some of these points now.
There we go. Lovely. Thanks a lot, Kelly. And can I encourage you, colleagues, to put your questions and comments in the chat, and I'm going to speak for a few minutes now, and then we'll have some time to open up for discussion. So just elaborating a little bit further in terms of what we as the university team, working closely with Kelly's colleagues, have been doing to develop the Challenge Fund approach. And we've got a team, a joint team of Cardiff University and Capital Region people working quite closely together. And we've taken the view that our role has at least two key strands of activities. One is very much to engage with local potential challenge holders from the public sector and third sector organisations, raising awareness of the challenge approach, and then working with them to scope the problem space, develop the appropriate challenge methodology and so on. And we've run a competitive process to identify the most promising challenges with which we can then offer further support and potentially invest. But we've also seen our role as a wider contribution to the capacity and capability of the actors in the region when it comes to mission-oriented innovation. So we've run a series of quite open workshops, taken an inclusive approach to what it means to express an interest in a challenge fund application, so that we're trying to reach out and raise awareness and be a friendly source of information on this approach, which we believe will become increasingly significant to regional actors within the Cardiff Capital Region, within Wales, and certainly throughout the UK. And Kelly touched on the Infuse programme. This is also run in partnership between the university, Cardiff Capital Region, Monmouthshire Council in particular, and our friends and colleagues from Nesta Wales. And this is a skills development programme that touches on adaptation and how to adopt and adapt innovations within your own organisation. It also has a data lab looking at the use and application of data, and it has centres on procurement as a key lever for grounding and benefiting from innovation activity in the public sector. And so through that programme, in conjunction with the Challenge Fund scheme, we're trying to produce an intervention into the region that both creates opportunity and builds capacity to take those opportunities. And the Infuse programme, we hope in the future, will begin to develop a pipeline of prospective challenges through the cohort of people that have undertaken the course. Next slide, Bill, please. So this is a brief pictorial representation of how, at least I tend to think about what we're doing and how that fits alongside that broader brush picture that Kelly's outlined for you in terms of the Cardiff Capital Region. Now, conventional innovation policy very much tends to focus on strengths in particular clusters, which are predominantly, if not exclusively, centred on particular technologies. And as Kelly touched on, we certainly have examples of that in the region. But in the work that myself, Dylan and Kevin have done for Welsh Government, looking at innovation policy and innovation strategy for the nation, we've also been keen to underscore the importance of what's been termed the innovation commons, or the raw materials of innovation, the capabilities, resources, connectivity of a physical geographical space, a region, which are the basics that are going into the mix of where new innovation activity might come from. And our view is that both that concentration of innovative activity in the clusters and that wider attention to the raw materials of innovation are important. And our role as the university, in part at least, through these programs of activity, is to try and catalyse spillover effects and benefits from the clusters out into the region on the one hand, and also look to play our part in nurturing and facilitating innovation through attention to the commons, as I mentioned, through the Infuse programme, but also, I think importantly, in encouraging connectivity and that community of practice around the mission approach and challenge-oriented innovation. Next slide, please, Dylan. So first off, some observations on what we've learned when it comes to try and deliver this in practice. Certainly, the pandemic has created some key issues for us, and more importantly, I should say, for the public sector organisations with whom we were expecting to be able to work to develop challenges. So I think it's important to acknowledge the peculiarities of the specific circumstances within which we've been working. We've been developing this over around the last 14, 15 months or so. So it's been throughout that period. But I think it would have been the case in any case that capacity and capability are fairly short in supply because people are extremely busy in the day job. So one of the first things we've realised is that we need to identify those most promising ideas and the people who've got that motivation and commitment to get engaged, and work with them as closely as we can to try and support and develop those initial ideas. One of the things we've tried to do alongside that is ensure that we're providing useful advice to people, even if they can't take forward the ideas themselves, so that they've got somewhere else that they can look for support, because we've quite often had problems that have come to us that aren't really appropriate for challenges. On the other hand, what we also need to be aware of is how we can try and develop the capacity to learn as we go. So that's an early point for us, but historically we've found that local developments are often quite limited in the degree to which they can generate further good practice and can be rolled out. So that attention to detail, I think, is going to be important for us, and the specifics of the very local context within which particular opportunities are being developed. And as we've touched on already, we see public procurement as a key mechanism, a key lever for supporting local innovation and for identifying how innovation can begin to address some of these societal challenges. But certainly in the public sector context in the UK and in Wales, there are some capacity issues when it comes to the procurement professionals who for too long have been beaten up with a discourse around austerity, cost saving, and perhaps have lacked the kind of political leadership that we think is going to be important if we're going to have more ambition and be more creative in how we leverage public sector spending to support innovation activity. Next slide, please, Dylan. Okay, and then if we scroll back and talk a little bit less perhaps about our own experiences, but begin to put this in the context that Dylan outlined at the beginning of the presentation, and thinking about some of what we're anticipating perhaps yourselves and others interested in this approach might be experiencing, and we're very keen to hear your thoughts on this. If we go back to the literature, then we can see three issues that are often raised when it comes to delivering on mission-oriented innovation. The first, this question of a spatial sensibility, a sense of identity within the city, the region, the municipality, and the recognition of the contribution that can be made at that level through the role that cities and regions can play. And as Dylan introduced at the beginning, there's certainly a complex political system that's emerging in Wales and in the UK, and I think there's a gradual and growing recognition of the significance of subnational actors, regional actors in the innovation agenda. And Kelly very neatly outlined some of the way in which she and her team are taking the lead in carving out that space and beginning to develop that sense of identity and place within the Cardiff Capital Region. A second issue that the literature flags is around a social deficit and the degree to which citizens are engaged in shaping and informing the specifics of individual challenges and indeed the overarching mission approach that's being adopted. For us, we were given three themes by the cabinet of political leaders that make up that are made up from the 10 local authorities in the Cardiff Capital Region. So a degree of representativeness there in terms of the overarching agenda, but we are largely at this point reacting to opportunities that are brought to us by prospective challenge holders. But we have begun to be a bit more proactive in shaping some of our efforts and activity. For example, in addressing the climate crisis and addressing decarbonisation in local authorities, and also when it comes to trying to identify ways that we can work with stakeholders and representatives of our most challenged communities in ways that can support and offer transformatory input into some of our most disadvantaged local communities in the region. So we're beginning to build that capacity to be proactive, but also engage more directly with concerns of our citizens. And then thirdly, this sort of spread and scale dilemma. And we're at an early stage in our own understanding of what we're trying to do here, but that sort of schematic I put forward a few moments ago tries to capture some of what we see as potential mechanisms through which practices that are being effective somewhere might then be incorporated, for example, into the professional development programme of Infuse, or might be shared with others within the region and beyond. And we're very keen to look beyond the region when it comes to lessons and opportunities for learning as well. But there's no doubt that the specificities of the particular context and the challenge that we might be working on make it somewhat difficult to be confident around the spread and scale of the innovation activity that we're undertaking. So we're conscious of that. We don't have a magic wand, of course, to be able to say how we would address that. Again, we'd be keen to hear from yourselves. And then the last slide, I think, from me, please, Dylan. So some final reflections, and I speak to some of the points that Kelly was making earlier. As an academic, as the academic team, our view is that the societal challenge focus really does underscore the importance both of collaboration, that's us collaborating with the capital region, but also the public sector bodies and the innovators within the region in trying to mobilise the mission approach. It also emphasises the importance of interdisciplinarity. And the Centre for Innovation Policy Research is interdisciplinary largely within the social sciences and humanities at Cardiff University, but certainly when it comes to specific projects, whether those are looking at health and well-being issues or whether they're looking at decarbonisation issues, have been keen to engage expertise from other parts of the academy, including engineering, medical school and so on. That said, our view is that because a mission approach needs to be in part at least about collaboration, connectivity, engagement, organisation, then expertise of social sciences is valuable in how those approaches are delivered in practice. And indeed, you know, what we would encourage is innovation and ambition when it comes to policy and much more besides, because if we do take that step back and think about what it would mean to deliver a mission-oriented approach within the UK, within Wales, within even the Cardiff Capital Region, then there are questions, I think, that need to be asked about the institutions and mechanisms that are currently in place at regional level, at national level, if we were to deliver on the agenda that Mazzucato and colleagues have outlined and advocated for in a very compelling way. So thanks very much for your attention. I don't know how this happens, but hopefully Dylan and Kelly will rejoin me. And the opportunity now, colleagues, it's very strange, these events, when you can't see anybody on there, but the opportunity now, colleagues, is for you to ask us some questions. I've got a hello from Judith in Austria. So hello, Judith. Sorry, we're not able to respond in the chat. So I can't type hello to you, but hello. And a question from John. Two questions from John. First off, Kelly, I think this is probably for you in the first instance to reflect on. Resistance or scepticism from within the 10 local authorities?
Very little, I think, Rick, because I think we've spent a long time building up this narrative. And I think we're lucky that the 10 authorities in the capital region really see their role isn't just about, heads down delivering services. I think the whole COVID experience has taught them that they can innovate faster, that perhaps some of the rules that limit progress over the years are really just custom and practice and not really rules. So I think on the back of, the COVID pandemic, I think the appetite for innovation to do different things has really been captured and harnessed really successfully. I think, to be totally frank and honest, though, it was about timing. I think with our Cardiff Capital Region City deal, we've put together a portfolio of projects. Some have been fairly traditional, transport schemes, local energy improvements, housing viability gap fund. But increasingly over time, I think we've bought the purchase to do more innovative and creative things. So I think having a portfolio approach in place gives us that solid platform. On the challenge fund, I think it's really been helped by the fact that in the first instance, we focus quite a lot on local authority direct problems, as well as, the problems local authorities can convene around in relation to, local civic society. So, for example, one of the first challenges we launched was around an LEV net zero fleet challenge, trying to get the 10 local authorities to work together to procure one fleet with the same ambitions and directives, to think about how they could pool resources differently, and to think about how the challenge-driven approach really could mobilize a different way of thinking about their assets, and not, just doing it as 10 individual local authorities, but thinking about this collective sense of owning assets and, as I say, pooling resources and thinking about, the investment case on a very different level. So I think all of those things have helped, Rick, to build the confidence. But increasingly now, I think, they're coming to us with many other things that could be run through a challenge-driven approach. Big issues around social care, introduction of real living wage, the impact that that's having on the care market, thinking about issues in children's services, social services in particular, which I think are come into the fore increasingly around mental health and so on. We're getting, I think, a lot in terms of the future of high streets. That seems to be a really big issue in terms of the post-pandemic recovery. So I think, local authorities are increasingly getting in the mindset and the habit of not resorting to safe bets and, some of the same old answers and the same old approaches, and really starting to challenge the system. And I think hopefully that's where mission-driven thinking can really come into its own. And as I say, is something that we can think about. At the moment, we focus quite a lot on data, on procurement, on adaptation. But increasingly, Rick, I think there are other aspects of the challenge-driven process we'd like to bring to the fore. So not just focusing on problems and challenges, but really identifying where some of those big opportunities and some of those big shifts can happen as well. So yeah, long answer to a short question. I don't think there's a silver bullet, but I think it's about buying that confidence, trying different things, but giving local authorities the comfort in the first place that some of these benefits can apply to them directly. And then we can scale up to approaches which embrace wider local civic societies. You're muted, Rick.
I'm not.
Oh, you are. You're off now.
Is that working now?
Yeah.
I can hear you now.
Yeah. There's a gremlin somewhere. So, Kel, that answer actually began to address one of the other questions. So you're allowed to have taken an extra minute or two. The second part of John's question was around budgets and the scale of budgets. So I'll just say a word or two about the Challenge Fund, and then maybe, Kel, you can explain a little bit about the finances of the city deal overall. So, John, the Challenge Fund is a £10 million investment in the team and the funding for challenges. We've got around £8 million of challenge funding available. The largest of the challenges that we've signed off on to date is one that looks at local food supply and food resilience. And that's just over £2 million worth of commitment, subject to satisfactory progress through, we're using a variation on the SBRI model, if you're familiar, that with three stages. So an initial framing where innovators offer their ideas. The most promising of those are giving some funding to take those ideas through to a prototype level or to at least do some market testing and trialling. And we've got a third phase available that will support activity that will lead us close to market. But there's a sort of stage gate approach. So the funding at the challenge fund level is not insignificant for individual funds. But Kelly, that needs, I think, to be explained and set in the context of the city deal overall, because as John points out, there has been pressure on budgets at local authorities. So we are utilising the city region's city deal to provide this support. So maybe you can just set that context for John a little bit further.
Yeah, I'm really sorry, John, that I didn't say this as I started to give the answer there. Sorry, I forgot about the second part of the question. But yeah, Rick is right that the Challenge Fund is a small seed fund in essence, is only £10 million. But as I said at the outset, we've got a £1.3 billion city deal, £500 million in a wider investment fund. And I suppose what we've tried to do from the get-go, John, is apply challenge thinking to that. As I said at the outset, we're not here to give grants or one-off subsidies for, projects that do okay, but don't really have, the maximum impact they could have. So what we've done is to be quite commercial in our approach, to look for driving returns, maximising private sector leverage. Co-investment is also a condition of any investments that we make, because we believe that if we can create a return, then we're building our own resilience by recycling that and equipping ourselves to do even more of the same. So there's lots more money in the wider investment fund to scale some of these ideas and ambitions beyond the Challenge Fund. But as part of the City Deal framework, we've also set up subsidiary impact funds. So we recognise that if a business comes through the Challenge Fund with a really successful idea, they may need startup funding or scale-up funds. They may need to access our strategic premises fund because they may need, accommodation or a base. They may be part of our clusters framework and strategy because they're going to need to interact with other businesses and help develop that ecosystem. So I think for us, increasingly, this can't be about a one-off intervention. It's got to sit as part of a suite of wider measures that help support the whole of the system. So again, not an easy or a short answer, but hopefully it's more of a cultural approach that I think we're taking to try and to nurture challenge-driven innovation.
Great, thanks, Kel. Dylan, I wonder if you want to give a few thoughts on this one, and then maybe also Kel from the sort of, on the one hand, more the literature and theory side, and then on the other hand, the practice. In the conversation there, Judith has asked about the relationship between a challenge-driven approach and a mission-driven approach. So, Dill, maybe you want to offer a few reflections from the literature, and then Kelly, we've in some ways been using the terms a little bit interchangeably, but I think we've got a clearer sense of that, perhaps, which you could come to in your response.
So if I go first, I think we're talking about quite fine differences really between the two in the way that they are being used in the literature. As Rick said, largely interchangeable, but they obviously come from different perspectives. The idea about challenge-driven innovation in the innovation space is perhaps a little bit more developed in the past 10 or 20 years. Essentially pointing towards future challenges is not necessarily policy related, where I guess the idea of mission innovation policy as it's come to bear is very much focused around what we can do in policy terms. But I go back to my original points, some very fine differences here. As such, Kelly, you might have a different perspective.
No, I think there are fine differences, Dill. I think for us at the moment, that the challenge-driven stuff has just been more immediate. I think in the COVID aftermath, it's been really not easy, but it's been more straightforward, I think, to identify what may feel like fairly low-level challenges, but things that could have a big impact. So, for example, there's a number of different things at the moment around net zero, and in that space, it wouldn't take too much imagination to put a mission-driven roof over some of those things and bring them together as a package. We're yet to do that, but I think the big opportunity and the thing that I feel really excited about is the opportunity to really codify this approach, and that's why we have the university as key academic and delivery partners, as well as others, and to think about how we give some more thought and interpretation really to this concept of a public services testbed. In the Cardiff Capital Region, we're home to the Office for National Statistics. The Chief National Statistician is based here. We're home to the Intellectual Property Office, Companies House. There's a subnational data strategy that's going to be published soon as part of the Levelling Up white paper. And I think taking that data to help us really understand problems, then channeling it through a mission-driven approach with all of those features we spoke about, public procurement, adaptation, working to build the skills and competencies of vocational public services, and then churning out new products, services, functions, developments. I think that gives us the whole ecosystem, and it's certainly something I'm really interested in developing further, as I know our 10 politicians are.
Thanks, Kel. Yeah, I suppose it's worth just mentioning, and with last few minutes now, I mean, the Challenge Fund specifically came out of conversations that myself, Kelly, colleagues from the university, colleagues from Nesta were having around this idea of a public services testbed, which was quite large, quite ambitious, perhaps had some of the characteristics of a mission approach. Indeed, we invoked some of that thinking in those ideas. But, the conclusion was we needed to get to something more manageable, more granular, begin to demonstrate the value of this approach in practical terms before we could, expect to be able to operate at the scale that a mission approach might require. So I do think there's an element of iterating between the ambition and pragmatically demonstrating the value of the approach, that we're hopefully in an initial stage of the latter, and as long as we continue to deliver in the way that Kelly imagines that the region wants to operate, we're optimistic that this will then be a key contributor to the scale of ambition that Kelly's anticipating that the region will evolve through. And I think in a sense that also speaks perhaps to one of Judith's questions around the relationship between quite an open approach and a quite an objective driven approach. And my view personally, and then hand over to Kelly for the final word, is, we are in a context where we're going to be held accountable for a number of different key indicators that demonstrate the value and the impact of what we're doing. But as Kelly said earlier, we don't want to just be delivering on the metrics in a very kind of narrow and instrumental sense. So we want to retain the openness and the capacity to flex and respond to opportunities that are presented to us, whether that's from the political leaders or from our constituents. So there's again a balance between being tied in to a very structured approach and then being able to flex and respond to opportunities as they arise. Kel, we're being warned that we need to finish soon. So if there are last questions from the audience, please ask them. Otherwise, Kel, I'll hand over to you, and then Dill for any final thoughts you may have.
Yeah, I think it's just about the agility that you mentioned, Rick, and ensuring we build that into the process, because there's no point progressing something that we started out with all best of intentions of doing if we find through the process it's not going to work. So I think it's about self-awareness as well. It's about some of those cultural issues, but the sense of openness that I support is because we are in a place, we're in the region, as I say, we've got the local authority area that sits at the very bottom of the UK competitiveness index. There's nearly 300 local authorities in the UK that make up that index, cheek by jowl with a capital city that has different levels of prosperity and productivity. So the openness, I think, allows us to have this conversation about inclusive growth. How can we spread the benefits and think differently about the place dimension of our region? That's a really important part of our discussion. And I think as we shape this concept for public services testbed going forward, that's something that we need to keep at the heart of it. So yeah, an open process, I think, allows us to be much more equitable, think about the direction and distribution of innovation, but it's also knowing about when to rein things in and to pull back, especially if something isn't working. Rick, there's a question there that Judith asked as well about the white paper. So Judith, the new Ministry for Levelling Up Communities and Housing is about to publish the Levelling Up white paper, which I'm really interested in, because levelling up has massive connotations for how we tackle regional economic disparities. I'm particularly interested in the research and innovation dimensions of that. And as I understand it, there will be a subnational data strategy that gets published as part of that, which again, I think is really opportune and goes to the heart of the discussion that we've been having this afternoon.
Yeah, great. Thanks, Kel. Yeah, Judith, unfortunately, the hosts aren't able to post in the chat. So, but that particular white paper, we have been waiting for it for quite some time. It's not actually yet been produced from UK government. Dill, any final thoughts or reflections from you? We're just about to end here.
Indeed, yes. 5 minutes to go. I think for me, that's the first time I've heard you, Kelly, talking about the various different projects within the capital region, and I guess I was quite taken by the idea that I spoke about, which I could see quite clearly in the capital region, which is the drawing together the socio-ecological innovation, whether that be in Infuse or whatever, alongside the more traditional science and technology-based forms of innovation. So actually bringing these two forms of innovation together within your policies to support innovation. So yeah, no, it's very interesting. Thank you.
Thanks very much. Right, okay, I think we're done. Thanks everybody for joining us. Slightly odd experience, I have to say. All of these are a bit weird, but this platform's been the weirdest yet for having no idea who's out there and mostly what you're thinking. Sometimes that's an advantage, of course, to us as speakers. But we appreciate you joining us. Cal, lovely to see you. Thanks for coming along. Dill, likewise. And Kevin just texted towards the end going, "Why? What are you after me for? What's up?" So I'll phone him in a minute. Thank you, everybody. And
thank you, everybody. Goodbye. Bye-bye.
Thanks, everyone.
Enjoy the rest of the conference. Bye-bye.